precocious, and immersed himself in his studies, but something was amiss. Kaczynski was withdrawn. He spent much of his time alone and showed aggression towards his peers. In 1958, 16-year-old Ted Kaczynski enrolled at Harvard University. While there, Kaczynski volunteered to be a subject in a dubious psychological experiment. Brilliant yet reclusive outcasts were the recruits of choice for the project. The subjects were given code names. Kaczynski's was Lawful. Participants were told to write down their world philosophy, their personal manifesto. Their views were then openly challenged. The goal was to test their emotional strength. Heart and breathing rates were measured. Kaczynski responded wildly, brimming with fury. The study lasted for 3 years.
This continual tormenting at such an impressionable age could have affected Kaczynski, building long-term hostility that would find an outlet later in life. Perhaps these experiences and his genius mind put him on a path of evil.
Some research shows that highly intelligent brains grow differently to normal brains, and that negative events can have more lasting effects.
We know that in some people who have a very high IQ, there's a cost associated with this high mental functioning.
Dr. Paul Thompson is a neurologist at the University of California at Los Angeles. He maps the growing brain and explores how high intelligence may affect behavior. One study scanned the brains of high and average intelligence subjects every year for several years.
So basically what we do is we take a snapshot of how the brain looks every year, and then we kind of compile these into a movie.
During the first 3 years of life, a normal brain has billions of cells making 1 million new neural connections every day. The brains of extremely intelligent youngsters have even more brain cells. Their brains are more active and make even more neural connections. Dr. Thompson's results show a remarkable pattern. Highly intelligent brains need an average of 2 extra years to make and organize neural connections and to mature.
This is a really surprising finding. You might think that smart children, everything happens sooner. Their brain grows faster, grows earlier.
Does this difference in brain development affect behavior? Can traumatic events have a greater impact on the slow-to-mature brains of the highly intelligent?
There's some evidence that at the very high end of IQ, they may become socially withdrawn, they may not take the time to focus on other emotional areas of development, and we think that an extreme focus on intellectual pursuits might be detrimental.
It's not likely that this different growth rate makes a brilliant mind more vulnerable to violence. But studies have shown that negative childhood experiences can destroy brain cells and impair emotional development. Thompson has demonstrated this by tracking brain maturation through early adulthood. He has discovered that from birth to 20, the developing brain is very impressionable.
And so any experiences that you have during that time are critical for the future development of the brain in adulthood.
Could Ted Kaczynski's early childhood and late teenage traumas have led to his violent impulses? Kaczynski graduated from Harvard in 1962. He might have become an accomplished mathematician. Instead, his genius helped him become one of America's most renowned terrorists, the Unabomber. After Harvard, Kaczynski earned a PhD and landed a plum teaching position at the University of California at Berkeley. But 2 years later, he resigned and retreated to a solitary life in the Montana wilderness. He he would soon put into motion his violent plan to eradicate modern technology, which he believed was destroying humanity. In 1978, he sent his first parcel bomb to the science department at the University of Chicago. Over the next 9 years, bombs arrived at other universities and businesses. 24 victims were wounded and disfigured. Each time the explosives were more powerful and deadlier, but they contained not a shred of evidence. Kaczynski took extreme measures to hide his crimes. He lined his shoes with a smaller sole so that his footprints could not be identified. The bombs were made from stolen and homemade materials, all untraceable. And he recorded his every move in code, so they'd make no sense if discovered. Then, in 1987, the Unabomber seemed to disappear.
His master plan was grand. It required someone of superior intelligence and made him an unpredictable killer.
The Unabomber's inactivity raised concerns for investigators.
His period of silence made it worrisome because it's waiting for the other shoe to drop. He may take a recess from his bombing activities to reevaluate, to improve on his devices.
Dave Weber was part of the task force chasing the Unabomber. After years on the investigation, officials were struggling for answers.
In the early days, there were no clues to tie the bombings together whatsoever.
After the first letter bomb in 1978, another had turned up a year later at Northwestern University, also in Chicago. Then another one detonated inside an aeroplane. There were injuries, but no deaths. In 1985, the Unabomber claimed his first murder, a California computer store owner. More than 15 other victims were wounded and disfigured. Seemingly random targets, no apparent motive, and no clues. Kaczynski was covering his tracks meticulously.
He made his own pipes. He knew that pipe material might be traced, so he would make his own lead pipes, wrap it with tape.
Kaczynski collected strands of hair from public washrooms and planted them in bombs to mislead investigators.
Kaczynski had a mind of a chess master. He was always thinking steps ahead to outpace and confuse investigators. He was dogged and willing to go to great lengths to perfect his plans.
Despite the harsh Montana terrain, Kaczynski traveled far and wide to gather bomb parts. Living off the land and in deep seclusion, he survived on $300 a year. Periodically, he would ask his family for money so he could travel to other cities to post the parcel bombs. His extreme measures succeeded in keeping the authorities at bay. Eventually, Ted Kaczynski was caught, but not by any of the scores of police, FBI agents, and investigators who were doggedly hunting him. For almost 18 years, the Unabomber eluded the police and FBI agents who were tracking him. His bombs were so cleverly designed, his attacks so seemingly random, that the authorities were at an almost total loss. They did, however, discover one connection among the bombs.
The triggering device was so unique, it wasn't known to any of the bomb technicians nationwide.
Eventually, a few other links between the bombings began to emerge. Each package had been posted with stamps depicting the playwright Eugene O'Neill, whose works touched on the theme of revenge. Detectives also noticed a wood-related theme. One victim's last name was Wood, another lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and one of the victims worked for a forestry group. They also noted that each bomb was encased in a wooden box. Desperate for leads, investigators looked into every possible wood-related industry.
It seems rather broad to look at it, but first of all, you have to look at the sources of the wood, and then from those sources, you look at the customer base. The wood leads are so immense, it's almost like counting stars.
Unfortunately, their efforts sent them down more dead ends.
These false leads were clearly tricks, games to throw off investigators. They were signs of a highly intelligent, clever mind.
But what Ted Kaczynski was creating in secrecy would eventually lead to his capture. During the Unabomber's hiatus from 1987 to 1993, Kaczynski was drafting a personal manifesto for the world to see and to define who he was. It was a 65-page proclamation that called for the destruction of modern life. It began, "The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race." Kaczynski criticized scientists, those who covet power, and those who fight passively.
His manifesto, ironically, damns the very kind of people who he is. Kaczynski himself was a scientist, and he craved power. Ostracized all his life, he was angry with the world that didn't accept him. He clearly found power by being the Unabomber. By plotting mail bomb schemes, he kills from afar, passively, an approach he condemns in the manifesto.
In 1996, investigators finally got their big break. A man came forward who was convinced that the Unabomber was his brother. After a month-long stakeout in Montana, Ted Kaczynski was arrested. Officials were shocked by the appearance of the man they had apprehended. He was gaunt, filthy, and wild-looking. But unlike his appearance, Kaczynski's cabin was clean and organized and packed with books, bombing materials, and weapons. It took the FBI 12 days to inventory the cabin's contents.
A search of his cabin uncovers a mad genius mind. Among serial killers, Ted Kaczynski is unique, killing not for sadistic pleasure, but for a philosophical cause. His manifesto shows a brilliant but pathological mind. To many, an evil genius.
Kaczynski was charged with killing 3 people and injuring 11. He pleaded guilty to all counts and was sentenced to life without parole. Dr. Stone places him on the scale of evil.
Because of his systematic planning of brutal but detached murders, I would place him on level 16. A place reserved for psychopaths committing multiple vicious acts. But unlike Kemper and Holmes, he killed from afar. He never faced down his victims. Therefore, he lands lower on the scale of evil.
Malicious masterminds. They seem to outmaneuver everyone. They get away with numerous murders. Their killing often goes on for years. They are hard to identify, conceal their intentions, and frequently strike when least expected. These traits make them perhaps the most dangerous of murderers. As Dr. Stone continues his investigation of